Summer, 1852. The banks of the Colorado River, near what would one day become Needles, California. Olive Oatman had learned to count days by the beatings. 367 sunrises since the Yavapai war clubs killed her parents. 367 nights trying to forget the sound her mother made when she died. Now, at 14 years old, standing barefoot in the sand, with her 10-year-old sister Marianne clutching her hand, Olive faced something worse than memory. The Mohave women approached slowly. There were 6 of them, moving across the sand with a confidence that made Olive's stomach twist. Each wore their hair long and loose in the desert wind. Each face bore the same marks, 5 vertical lines of brilliant blue-green tattooed from their lower lips down across their chins. The marks seemed to shimmer in the brutal sunlight, reflecting off the Colorado River behind them. Olive had seen these markings before. 2 days earlier, when the Mohave trading party arrived at the Yavapai camp with horses and blankets, offering to buy the white captives. She had watched the transaction with numb confusion. The Yavapai had beaten her daily, starved her deliberately, worked her until her hands bled. The Mohave seemed different. They smiled. They brought food. They spoke in gentle tones she couldn't understand. But those faces, every single Mohave bore the same permanent marks. Men, women, children, all tattooed. At first, Olive thought it was paint, something that could be washed away. Then she saw how the color seemed to come from beneath the skin itself, how the edges of each line showed the texture of scar tissue. The eldest of the women now stood directly in front of Olive. Her name was something that sounded like grinding stones. Later, Olive would learn it was Espanio, the wife of Chief Espanio. The woman reached out and gripped Olive's chin, turning her face side to side in the harsh light. She spoke rapidly in Mohave, gesturing to the other women. From a woven basket, one of the younger women produced what looked like sharpened sticks. Not knives, not metal, just cactus thorns, bound to small wooden handles. Their points darkened with something Olive couldn't identify. Another woman carried a flat stone with crushed minerals ground into powder, malachite perhaps, or chrysocolla, creating that distinctive blue-green color that marked every Mohave face. Marianne began to cry. Not the loud wailing that brought beatings from the Yavapai, but a quiet, desperate whimpering that broke something in Olive's chest. The little girl had survived their parents' murder, survived a year of captivity and starvation, survived the forced march to this river valley. Her blonde hair, once cut brutally short by their first captors, had grown back in uneven patches. Her face was sunburned and thin. Espaneo spoke again, gesturing to the ground. Sit. Olive understood without words. She understood the way you understand a snake coiling to strike, the way prey animals understand the approach of wolves. The heat pressed down on them. It must have been over 100 degrees, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance above the sand. The Colorado River moved past, sluggish and brown, carrying the snowmelt from mountains Olive would never see again. Mesquite smoke drifted from the village behind them, hundreds of dome-shaped houses, each holding tattooed faces, each filled with people who bore the permanent marks of their tribe. 2 of the Mohave women gripped Olive's shoulders. Not roughly, almost gently, but firmly. She could not rise, could not run. Marianne screamed as other hands took hold of her, forcing both girls to sit in the sand. Espanio knelt before Olive with the sharpened sticks. She said something that might have been reassurance. The tone suggested kindness, but the cactus thorns came closer, and Olive saw dried blood on their tips. Blood from previous ceremonies. Blood from the countless Mohave who had received these marks at puberty. These marks that declared them members of the tribe. These marks necessary for passage to the afterlife. But Olive was not Mohave. Neither was Marianne. They were slaves, property. And the marks they would receive would declare that truth permanently, visibly, impossibly to hide or deny. The first thorn touched her chin. Welcome to valor and violence. To understand why the Mohave tattooed their captives, we need to understand who the Mohave were and what drove their relentless cycles of warfare and slavery. The Mohave inhabited one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America, the Colorado River Valley, cutting through the Mohave Desert. Their territory stretched roughly 90 miles along the river, from Black Canyon in the north to the Needles area in the south, encompassing parts of what are now California, Arizona, and Nevada. Despite the brutal desert surrounding them, the Mohave thrived. The Colorado River's annual floods transformed narrow strips of land into fertile fields where they grew corn, beans, squash, and melons. Unlike many desert peoples, the Mohave were not nomadic. They built substantial villages, some containing over 200 dome-shaped houses, made from cottonwood poles and arrowweed. By the mid-1800s, the Mohave population numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people. They were the largest and most powerful of the Yuman-speaking tribes. More importantly, they were warriors. Anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, who studied the Mohave extensively in the early 1900s, wrote in his Handbook of the Indians of California, quote, "The Mohave were probably the most warlike group in the region. Their entire social organization and value system centered around warfare and the prestige it brought." End quote. This was not a tribe that raided occasionally for survival. War was the foundation of their culture, their religion, their identity. The Mohave fought constantly with their neighbors, the Pima to the east, the Maricopa to the southeast, the Yavapai and Apache to the south, the Mohave to the west. These were not border skirmishes or territorial disputes in the way European conflicts operated. The Mohave already controlled the best land, the river valley itself. They fought for something else entirely. They fought for revenge, for prestige, for the validation of their dream power, and for captives. Mohave warfare was deeply tied to their spiritual beliefs. Warriors gained power from dreams. A man who dreamed of becoming a great warrior would spend his life proving that dream true through combat. Leslie Spear, in his comprehensive study Human Tribes of the Gila River, documented how, quote, Mohave war parties often traveled hundreds of miles to attack enemies, sometimes walking for weeks to reach Maricopa or Pima territory, fighting a single battle, then walking home, end quote. These expeditions were planned, organized, and led by men whose dreams had given them supernatural power over their enemies. But Mohave raids had a practical purpose beyond glory. They took captives, lots of them, primarily women and children, though occasionally young men if they were deemed malleable enough. Anthropologist George Devereaux, who lived among the Mohave in the 1930s and conducted extensive interviews with elders, estimated in his work Mohave Ethnopsychiatry that, quote, at any given time in the traditional period, perhaps 5 to 10% of any Mohave village population consisted of slaves from other tribes, end quote. That translates to anywhere from 150 to 400 slaves spread across Mohave territory at the height of their power. These captives filled a permanent underclass in Mohave society. They performed agricultural labor during planting and harvest. They gathered mesquite beans in the desert, collected firewood, hauled water from the river. Female slaves often became additional wives or concubines to their owners. Children born to slave mothers remained slaves themselves, creating a generational system of bondage. And every single one of them was tattooed. The Mohave tattooed everyone. For free, Mohave, tattoos marked a transition to adulthood. Girls received their chin tattoos at puberty, usually between ages 11 and 14. Boys received theirs slightly later. The process was elaborate, ceremonial, accompanied by singing and ritual. The patterns varied. Some had 5 vertical lines. Others had more complex designs, incorporating horizontal elements. Some extended the marks onto their arms or breasts. The tattoos were created using sharpened cactus thorns or mesquite thorns, driven repeatedly into the skin, while crushed minerals, malachite, chrysocolla, sometimes charcoal were worked into the wounds. The result was a permanent blue-green color that would last a lifetime. But the tattoos meant more than decoration or tribal identification. In Mohave belief, the tattoos were spiritually necessary. When a person died, their spirit had to travel to the land of the dead, a place the Mohave called Avikwame, a sacred mountain far to the south. Without proper tattoos, the spirit could not make this journey. They would be refused entry, forced to wander as a ghost forever. Even the poorest Mohave received tattoos, even the sick, even the outcast, even the slaves. But slave tattoos were different. Where free Mohave received their marks ceremonially at puberty, slaves were tattooed immediately upon arrival. No ceremony, no celebration. Simply marking, the patterns were usually simpler, 5 straight vertical lines, from lower lip to chin. Nothing on the arms or chest, just enough to be unmistakable. The purpose was brutally practical. A tattooed captive could never escape and blend into another tribe, could never pass as free, could never hide what they were. The marks declared their status to anyone who saw them. In a region where dozens of tribes spoke different languages and maintained complex political relationships, the tattoos served as a universal language of ownership and subjugation. But there was a second purpose, one that revealed the complex moral universe the Mohave inhabited. They believed that even slaves had souls that required passage to the afterlife. To leave a captive untattooed would condemn them to eternal wandering after death. So the Mohave tattooed their slaves partly out of cruelty, permanent visible branding, and partly out of what they considered mercy. They were ensuring their captives' spiritual survival even while holding them in earthly bondage. This was the world Olive and Marianne Oatman entered in 1852. Two white girls, survivors of a massacre that had destroyed their family and left them enslaved first by the Yavapai, now traded to the Mohave like horses or blankets. They had endured a year of brutality, starvation, and grief. They had watched their parents die. They had seen their brother Lorenzo left for dead with his skull crushed. Now they would receive the marks that would define them for whatever remained of their lives. The marks that said, "You are property, you are other. You can never go home." The sharpened cactus thorns waited. The crushed minerals lay ready in their grinding stones. And Olive Oatman, 14 years old and already broken by loss, would learn exactly how much pain a human body could endure before consciousness mercifully fled. The road to Olive Oatman's tattooing began not on the banks of the Colorado River, but over a year earlier and 200 miles to the east, on a desolate stretch of trail near the Gila River in Arizona Territory. February 18th, 1851. The Oatman family had been traveling for months as part of a Mormon splinter group called the Brewsterites, followers of a man named James C. Brewster, who claimed divine revelation about establishing a colony in California. Most of the original group had turned back or scattered after disputes and hardships on the trail. By February, only the Oatman family continued Father Royce, Mother Marianne, and their 7 children ranging from 17-year-old Lorenzo down to baby Roland, just 18 months old. Olive was 13, Marianne 7. They were traveling in a single wagon pulled by exhausted oxen, following the Gila River west toward Fort Yuma and California beyond. Their supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Royce Oatman had been warned repeatedly by soldiers at various outposts that the route was dangerous, that small parties were vulnerable, that the Yavapai and Apache in the region had been increasingly hostile. He ignored every warning. His faith, he believed, would protect them. Late afternoon, on that February day, the family had stopped to rest the animals at a place where the trail rose steeply over a series of rocky hills. They were approximately 80 miles east of Fort Yuma, in territory the Yavapai considered their own. The landscape was harsh saguaro cacti standing like sentinels, ocotillo branches reaching toward a cloudless sky, the Gila River, a brown ribbon in the distance. A group of Yavapai warriors appeared on the trail ahead. Estimates vary, but Olive later recalled approximately 19 men. They approached the wagon not in a war formation, but casually, as if encountering the family by chance. They seemed friendly at first. They asked for tobacco, for food. Royce Oatman, already short on supplies, gave them what little he could spare, some bread, a few strips of dried meat. The warriors ate slowly, watching the family. Then they demanded more. Royce explained through gestures that he had nothing left to give. His children were hungry, his animals were weak. They needed everything they had to reach Fort Yuma. The mood shifted. One of the warriors spoke sharply to the others. They spread out around the wagon, surrounding the family. Royce Oatman must have seen what was coming. He reached for his rifle. He never touched it. The first warrior swung his club, made from ironwood, heavy as stone, and struck Royce in the head. Marianne Oatman screamed and grabbed for her younger children. The attack was swift and methodical. The Yavapai killed with clubs, not arrows or bullets. They killed Royce and Marianne. They killed 17-year-old Lucy. They killed 15-year-old Royce Jr. They killed 9-year-old Charity Ann and 3-year-old Roland. They dragged Lorenzo, 15 years old, away from the wagon and beat him until his skull fractured. They left him lying in the rocks, blood pooling beneath his head, presumed dead. They took Olive and Marianne. The warriors bound their hands and forced them to walk east, away from the massacre site, away from the bodies of their family, away from any hope of rescue. Behind them, the Yavapai looted the wagon and killed the oxen. Lorenzo Oatman would later regain consciousness and stumble to Fort Yuma, barely alive. But his sisters walked into captivity believing they were the only survivors, that everyone they loved was dead. For the next year, Olive and Marianne lived as slaves to the Yavapai. The treatment was brutal. They were beaten regularly. They were given barely enough food to survive, often just scraps after the Yavapai had eaten their fill. Their hair was cut short, a mark of slave status among many southwestern tribes. They were forced to gather firewood, carry water, perform endless labor from dawn to darkness. Marianne, only 7 years old, grew thin and weak. Olive, trying to protect her sister, took beatings meant for the younger girl. The Yavapai painted their faces for ceremonies and war, but they did not tattoo. They kept the girls as property, valuable enough to maintain, but not valuable enough to treat with any kindness. Olive learned to understand some of their language, enough to follow orders, enough to know when a beating was coming. Then, in the spring of 1852, everything changed. A Mohave trading party arrived at the Yavapai camp. The Mohave Yavapai were not enemies they occasionally traded and intermarried, but they were distinct peoples with distinct customs. The Mohave had heard about the white captives. They wanted them. The negotiations took days. The Mohave offered horses valuable in a region where raids and warfare constantly depleted herds. They offered blankets, beads, other trade goods. The Yavapai were reluctant at first. Captives were valuable. But the Mohave were persistent, and eventually a price was agreed upon. Olive and Marianne were told they were being traded. They understood little about what this meant. Would their new owners be better or worse? Would they survive the journey? Where were they going? The Mohave party, about a dozen men and women, led the sisters west toward the Colorado River. It took several days of walking through desert landscape. The Mohave were not cruel during the journey. They shared food, they allowed rest. But every face bore those distinctive tattoos, and Olive began to understand with creeping dread that those marks were not temporary, not decorative. They were permanent. And if every Mohave wore them, what did that mean for two white slave girls who would never be Mohave? The Mohave villages stretched for miles along the Colorado River's western bank. Olive had never seen so many people in one place. Hundreds of dome-shaped houses made from cottonwood poles and woven reeds clustered near the water. Children ran between the structures, their laughter carrying across the sand. Women ground mesquite beans on flat stones. Men sat in the shade repairing fishing nets and weapons. And every single-faced child, adult, elder, bore the blue-green tattoo marks across their chins. The trading party led Olive and Marianne to one of the larger houses near the river. This was the home of Chief Espanol, the village headman, and his family. Espanol was perhaps 50 years old, tall for a Mohave, with gray streaking his long black hair. His face bore not just the standard chin tattoos, but elaborate marks extending down his neck. His wife Espanol greeted the sisters with words Olive couldn't understand, but in a tone that seemed almost welcoming, almost kind. They were given food immediately. Not scraps, but actual portions. Roasted fish from the river, corn mush sweetened with mesquite, fresh melons. After a year of near starvation under the Yavapai, the abundance felt surreal. Marianne ate until she was sick, her shrunken stomach unable to handle the quantity. Olive forced herself to eat slowly, waiting for the trap, for the cruelty she knew must be coming. But days passed, and the cruelty didn't come. The family's daughter, a young woman named Topeka, was assigned to watch over them. Topeka was perhaps 19 or 20, with a quick smile and those same 5 vertical lines marking her chin. She tried to teach Olive and Marianne Mohave words. She brought them blankets at night. She showed them where to bathe in the river. Other women came to see the white captives. They touched Olive's dark hair, unusual among the Mohave, who had black hair almost universally. They examined Marianne's lighter complexion with curiosity. Children stared from a distance, giggling when Olive looked at them. The sisters were novelties, exotic additions to the household. But Olive noticed something else. Every visitor who came to see them would eventually touch their own chin tattoos while looking at the girls' unmarked faces. They would speak to Espanol in rapid Mohave, gesturing at the sisters. The conversations always had the same tone, questioning, suggesting, insistent. Olive asked Topeka through gestures and the few words she'd learned, "Why do all Mohave have these marks?" Topeka touched her own tattoos and spoke a long explanation that Olive couldn't fully follow. But she caught certain words, repeated, dead, spirit, mountain, necessary. Topeka seemed to be saying the marks were required for something after death, that without them, something bad would happen to the soul. 2 weeks after their arrival, on a morning when the sun had barely cleared the eastern mountains, Espanol came to wake Olive and Marianne. Her expression was serious but not angry. She gestured for them to come outside. 6 Mohave women waited in the sand near the river. All were older, all bore the traditional tattoos, and all carried materials Olive immediately recognized meant something terrible was about to happen. One woman held a woven basket filled with sharpened implements, cactus thorns bound to small wooden handles, each no longer than a finger but wickedly sharp. Another carried a flat grinding stone, with crushed minerals creating a blue-green powder. Others had strips of yucca fiber, wooden bowls of water, and bundles of desert willow bark. Topeka stood among them, her face sympathetic but resigned. This was happening. There was no escape. Espineo spoke in Mohave, her voice carrying the authority of someone explaining something important, something necessary. Topeka translated what she could into the broken mixture of Yavapai and gesture that Olive understood. The marks were required. Without them, when Olive and Marianne died, their spirits could not travel to Avikwame, the sacred mountain of the dead. They would wander forever as ghosts. The Mohave were doing this for their benefit, for their spiritual survival. Olive wanted to scream that she didn't believe in Avikwame, that she had her own God, that she didn't want their marks or their salvation. But what she believed didn't matter. She was property. Slaves didn't choose. Marianne began to cry, the high, desperate crying of a child who knows something awful is coming and has no power to stop it. She was 10 years old. She had survived her family's murder. She had survived a year of starvation and beatings. And now strange women were advancing with sharp instruments, and she didn't understand why. 2 of the Mohave women, gently but firmly, took hold of Olive's shoulders and guided her to sit in the sand. Others did the same with Marianne a few feet away. The river moved past them, indifferent. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another day of 100-degree heat. Espineo knelt before Olive with the basket of sharpened thorns. She selected one, examined its point in the light, and dipped it in the bowl of crushed minerals, mixed with some kind of plant sap. The mixture turned the color of turquoise, that distinctive blue-green that marked every Mohave chin. The old woman placed one hand under Olive's jaw, tilting her face upward. She said something in a soothing tone. Then she pressed the thorn against the soft skin below Olive's lower lip and drove it deep into her flesh. The pain was immediate and absolute. Not a sharp sting, but a burning, tearing sensation that seemed to explode through Olive's entire face. She tried to jerk away, but the hands on her shoulders tightened. Espineo withdrew the thorn and immediately plunged it in again, slightly lower. Then again, then again. Olive would later write in her memoir, quote, "The pain was like liquid fire coursing through my face. Each puncture felt as though a hot iron had been pressed into my skin and left there to burn." End quote. Marianne's screaming started, high-pitched, wordless, the sound of absolute terror. Olive couldn't turn to look at her sister, couldn't do anything but sit, as Espineo methodically drove the thorn into her chin again and again and again. The woman worked with the concentration of someone performing an important task, her wrinkled hands steady despite Olive's involuntary flinching. The pattern emerged through repetition. 5 vertical lines. The first line ran straight down from the center of her lower lip. Espineo made approximately 15 to 20 punctures for each line, working from top to bottom, pausing occasionally to dip the thorn back in the mineral mixture. Blood mixed with the blue-green pigment and ran down Olive's chin, dripping onto her chest and the sand below. The second line, parallel to the first, slightly to the right, another 20 punctures. The thorn going deep enough that Olive could feel it scraping against bone. Her face was swelling already, the tissue responding to the trauma with inflammation that made each successive puncture more painful than the last. Third line. Left side now, matching the symmetry. Olive's vision blurred with tears. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't give them the satisfaction, but her body betrayed her. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with blood and pigment. Fourth line. Marianne had stopped screaming and now made only low moaning sounds. Olive couldn't tell if her sister had fainted or simply run out of energy for noise. Fifth line. The final vertical mark, completing the pattern. Espineo worked slower on this one, ensuring the spacing was correct, that all 5 lines were properly aligned. When she finished, she sat back and examined her work with what might have been satisfaction. Olive's entire lower face felt like someone had held it over a fire. The throbbing pain pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She could taste blood in her mouth. Her chin was completely numb and simultaneously agonizing, a contradiction her mind couldn't process. But Espineo wasn't done. She took a handful of the crushed mineral mixture and pressed it directly into the fresh wounds. working it deep into the punctures with her fingers. This ensured the color would be permanent, would remain visible after the wounds healed. The additional pressure on traumatized tissue brought fresh waves of pain. Then she took strips of yucca fiber and bound them tightly across Olive's chin, holding the mineral mixture against the wounds, preventing it from being wiped away by blood or sweat. The binding was so tight Olive could barely move her jaw. The women holding her shoulders finally released their grip. Olive slumped forward, her hands instinctively moving to touch her face before Topeka caught them and pulled them away. No touching. The wounds needed time to set. The pigment needed to remain undisturbed. Olive looked at Marianne. Her little sister sat in the sand, her face wrapped in similar yucca bindings, her eyes vacant with shock. Blood had soaked through the bindings in places, creating dark stains. The women who had held her were speaking softly, praising her for being brave, though Marianne showed no sign of hearing them. The entire process had taken perhaps 3 hours. The sun was now high overhead. Heat shimmered off the sand. The Colorado River continued its eternal flow southward. Espineo stood and spoke to the other women. They gathered their materials, the basket of thorns, now bloodied, the grinding stone with its remaining pigment, the bowls and bindings. The ceremony was complete. 2 more slaves properly marked. 2 more spirits ensured safe passage to the afterlife. Topeka helped Olive stand. Her legs were weak, unstable. She managed to walk the short distance back to the house before collapsing on the sleeping mat. Marianne was carried by one of the other women, her small body limp. For the next week, Olive existed in a fog of pain and fever. Her face swelled grotesquely, the flesh so inflamed she could barely open her mouth. Eating was agony. Drinking was torture. Every slight movement of her jaw sent sharp pains through the wounds. The yucca bindings remained in place for 3 days, then were removed to reveal the damage beneath. The 5 lines were clearly visible, though surrounded by swollen, discolored tissue. The blue-green pigment had taken, worked deep into the dermis where it would remain forever. Scabs formed over the punctures. Olive desperately wanted to scratch them, to peel them away, but Topeka watched carefully and prevented any interference with the healing. Marianne fared worse. Her smaller body struggled more with the trauma. She developed a fever that lasted days. She barely ate. She lay on her mat, crying silently, her hand hovering near her face, but not quite touching it, as if she couldn't believe what had been done to her. After 10 days, the worst of the swelling subsided. After 2 weeks, the scabs began to fall away naturally. After 3 weeks, Olive could look at her sister and see the permanent result. 5 blue-green vertical lines running from Marianne's lower lip down across her chin, exactly like the marks on Olive's own face, exactly like the marks that would identify them as Mohave slaves for the rest of their lives. They tried to look at themselves in the river water, but the reflection was too distorted. It wasn't until they accidentally caught their images in a piece of polished shell that Olive fully understood. She looked Mohave now. Not fully, her facial structure was different, her coloring wrong. But the marks were unmistakable. Any hope of escape, of rescue, of returning to white society and pretending this had never happened, all of it was gone. The tattoos declared the truth. She had been a captive, she had been enslaved, she had been marked permanently as property of the Mohave people. And there was nothing, no technology, no medicine, no prayer that could ever remove what had been done. Life as tattooed slaves in the Mohave villages settled into a rhythm that was neither the horror of their Yavapai captivity nor anything resembling freedom. Olive and Marianne worked, but they were not beaten. They gathered mesquite beans in the desert, helped plant corn along the river, hauled water, ground seeds on stone metates until their hands blistered. The labor was hard, endless, but no worse than frontier farm work. What made it unbearable was the permanence. The tattoos healed into smooth scars, the blue-green lines as vivid as the day they were applied. Topeka told Olive through their improving communication that the marks would never fade. They were made with minerals from sacred mountains, mixed with sap from plants that grew near Vikwame. The Mohave believed the pigments contained spiritual power that ensured their permanence. Other slaves in the villages bore similar marks. Olive began to notice them, women and children, from the Pima tribe, from the Maricopa, from smaller groups she couldn't identify, all tattooed, all marked. Some had been captives for years, spoke fluent Mohave, had integrated into their owners' families as quasi-members. But the tattoos remained, declaring their origins, their status. A Pima woman named Nawacheka, who had been captured as a child 20 years earlier, showed all of her marks and said in broken Spanish, quote, "You never forget. The marks make sure you never forget what you are," end quote. The Mohave themselves seemed to view the tattoos as both practical and spiritual. A warrior named Irataba, who would later become famous as a chief who negotiated with American settlers, once explained to a fur trapper that, quote, "We mark them so they cannot lie about their origins. A tattooed slave cannot claim to be free, cannot deceive another tribe, cannot bring dishonor to those who treated them with mercy rather than death," end quote. The logic was circular, brutal, and absolute. For 2 years, Olive and Marianne existed in this limbo. They learned Mohave fluently. They participated in village life. Children who had once stared at them with curiosity now played with Marianne, though never as equals always, with the awareness that she was marked, different, lesser. Topeka continued to show them genuine affection, teaching them songs, sharing food, defending them when other Mohave tried to work them too hard. Chief Espaniel's household treated them better than the Yavapai ever had. But then came 1854, and with it, the drought. The Colorado River, which had flooded predictably every spring for generations, ran low. The crops planted in the rich silt failed. Mesquite trees produced fewer beans. Desert plants that the Mohave relied on for supplemental food withered in the heat. By late summer, the entire river valley faced starvation. The Mohave themselves went hungry. They slaughtered horses for meat. They consumed stores of dried food meant for winter. They traveled further into the desert searching for anything edible. And slaves, as always in times of famine, received even less than their owners. Marianne had never fully recovered her strength from the year with the Yavapai. Now, at age 11, she began to waste away. Olive watched helplessly as her sister grew thinner, weaker. The child's ribs became visible through her skin. Her tattooed face looked skeletal, the blue-green marks standing out starkly against pale, drawn flesh. Topeka tried to help, sneaking extra portions of what little food existed. Espanio sometimes gave Marianne broth made from boiled bones, but it wasn't enough. In early 1855, Marianne became too weak to stand. She lay on the sleeping mat, her breathing shallow, her eyes glassy with fever. Olive sat with her constantly. She held her sister's hand. She told her stories about their parents, about the farm in Illinois before their family joined the Brewsterites, about the mother who had been dead now for 4 years. Marianne rarely responded. Her last coherent words were asking if they would see their mother again when they died. On a morning in late February, 1855, Marianne Oatman died. She was 11 years old. Her tattooed face, marked permanently with symbols of Mohave ownership, stared up at nothing. The Mohave buried her in the traditional way, in a shallow grave by the river, her few possessions placed beside her. Topeka wept. Even Espaneo seemed genuinely sad. They had cared for the child in their way. But care and ownership were not contradictory to the Mohave. They could mourn a slave the same way they might mourn a beloved horse. Olive was now alone among hundreds of tattooed faces, the only surviving member of a family that had once numbered 9. She remained with the Mohave for another year, moving through days in numb routine. But outside the river valley, events were shifting. American settlers were flooding into California following the gold rush. Fort Yuma had been established at the confluence of the Colorado and Gila rivers. The U.S. Army was making its presence known. In February 1856, a Yuma messenger named Francisco arrived at the Mohave villages. He carried a message from the Fort Yuma commander: return the white woman or face military action. The Mohave had no interest in war with the well-armed Americans. After days of negotiation, Chief Espaniel's family reluctantly agreed. On February 22, 1856, Olive Oatman began the 20-day journey back to Fort Yuma. Topeka cried when they parted. Espaneo gave Olive a blanket for the journey. The farewell was genuinely emotional. These people had enslaved her, tattooed her, kept her as property, but they had also kept her alive, shared their food, shown her moments of kindness within a brutal system. When Olive arrived at Fort Yuma, the soldiers barely recognized her as white. She wore Mohave dress made from bark. She spoke Mohave more fluently than English. Her dark hair hung long in the Mohave style, and across her chin, impossible to miss, were 5 blue-green vertical lines that declared to everyone who saw her exactly what she had been. The fort's surgeon examined her and wrote in his report, Quote, "The tattoos are permanent and appear to have been made with considerable skill. There is no medical procedure known that could remove them without causing severe scarring worse than the tattoos themselves." End quote. Olive was reunited with her brother Lorenzo, who had miraculously survived his skull fractures and spent 5 years believing both his sisters dead. The reunion was joyful and heartbreaking. Lorenzo stared at her tattooed face and wept. His little sister had been marked forever by the people who destroyed their family. Olive would spend the rest of her life trying to hide those marks and failing. Olive Oatman left the Mohave villages, but she never truly escaped them. The 5 blue-green lines across her chin ensured that. In 1857, she published her captivity narrative with the help of a pastor named Royal Stratton. The book became a sensation. Americans were fascinated and horrified by stories of white women held captive by Indians, and Olive's account had everything: family, massacre, years of slavery, exotic tribal customs, and most visibly, those permanent tattoos. She went on the lecture circuit, traveling across the country, telling her story to packed audiences, but she always wore high collars, always positioned herself in dim lighting, always tried to minimize the visibility of the marks she could never hide. In 1865, she married a man named John Fairchild. They adopted a daughter. They moved to Texas, later to Michigan. Olive lived a conventional life, by all appearances: wife, mother, church member, but photographs from the period show her always with her hand partially covering her chin, or her face turned at angles that obscured the tattoos, or wearing scarves arranged to hide what couldn't be removed. She died on March 20th, 1903, at age 65. The tattoos were still visible on her face in death. The Mohave continued tattooing their own people through the 1880s, though the practice declined under pressure from missionaries and government agents. The last fully tattooed Mohave died in the early 1900s, taking with them the traditional knowledge of the ceremony, the songs, the spiritual significance of the marks. The Colorado River Reservation, established in 1865, confined the Mohave to a fraction of their traditional territory. The U.S. military presence made raiding impossible. The slave system that had sustained itself for generations collapsed within a decade, but the scars remained literal and metaphorical. For the Mohave, tattooing had been an expression of identity, spirituality, and social order. For their captives, it was the ultimate form of control, a brand that couldn't be hidden or denied, a permanent declaration of what had been done to them. We look back at Olive Oatman's story and see the horror of the tattoos, the cruelty of permanent marking. And it was cruel, but the Mohave didn't see it that way. They believed they were ensuring these captive souls could reach the afterlife. They thought they were showing mercy by marking slaves rather than killing them outright. Topeka genuinely cared for Olive, even while her family kept Olive as property. These contradictions aren't easy to resolve. They shouldn't be. The Mohave tattoos remind us that humans are capable of systematically dehumanizing others while simultaneously caring for them. That we can be cruel and kind within the same breath. That permanent visible marking, whether tattoos on slaves, brands on prisoners, or badges on outcasts, serves the same purpose across cultures: to declare that some people are fundamentally different, fundamentally lesser, and that this difference should be visible to all. Olive Oatman spent 47 years trying to hide 5 lines on her chin. They were roughly 2 inches long, less than a quarter-inch wide, blue-green pigment embedded in skin, and they defined her entire life. Thank you for watching Valor and Violence. If this story moved you, check out our other episodes on frontier captivity narratives: Herman Lehman's 9 years among the Apache and Comanche, or Fannie Kelly's 6 months with the Lakota. These stories of survival reveal truths about the American frontier that textbooks often sanitize. What other aspects of Native American warfare and culture would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below. And if you have questions about the Mohave, about tattooing practices, or about other captivity experiences, we'd love to hear them. This history is difficult, complex, and important. Thank you for engaging with it.